So I'm an investigative reporter. What is that? There are more eloquent definitions, but they all boil down to this: someone who's driven to obsessively and methodically expose what's really going on. A stirrer-upper. That's what Vera Connolly called herself. She was an investigative reporter in the 1920s, and she stirred up a lot of trouble for operators of sweatshops and for government officials responsible for deplorable conditions on Indian reservations. My personal favorite, Chicago slumlord that I was investigating, called me a news hawk on a scum hunt. I thought he was right on both accounts. An iceberg. So 90% of an iceberg's mass is below the surface. The same can be said about the truth. So investigative reporters spend a lot of time down there. If you want to find the truth, you have to get wet now and then. A little more on that later. The limitations that I encounter tend to be physical objects. And the challenge for me is to keep those physical objects from becoming mental obstacles, which are harder to deal with. So come with me on an investigation as I encounter the locked gate, the closed door, the unanswered phone, and the most formidable of all, the closed lips. The investigation was for this book. It was originally a series at the LA Times, and after I came here in 2006, I turned it into a book. But we need to really go back to 1969, when newspapers across the country ran photos and stories about the massacre of 500 Vietnamese civilians. Not by the enemy, not by terrorists, but by US soldiers. This shocked Americans, and the Nixon administration went to great lengths to persuade the public, which was already growing very uneasy about the war, that this was an anomaly, an isolated incident committed by rogue units. But behind the scenes, the White House asked the Pentagon for information on any other war crimes, any other atrocities that had been reported, and this launched a secret, massive collection of records that amounted to 9,000 pages of evidence of US war crimes in Vietnam by the end of the war. The public was never told about this. The records were simply locked away after the war. 20 years later, they were declassified quietly, as required by the law, and eventually made their way to the National Archives just a mile down the road, and that's where I came into the picture. The archivist there tipped off a war historian, Nick Turse, that the records existed, and he came to me a few years later and asked if I wanted to investigate them with him. So we joined forces. The first thing I did was take all those records and put them into a spreadsheet. And this is what it added up to: 300 allegations of murder, massacre, torture, rape, mutilation, looting, destruction, confirmed by the Army in its investigation. Another 500 that had been reported but classified as unfounded, but upon closer inspection, a quarter of those had been verified as well. Now, this was not a full accounting of US war crimes in Vietnam. It really was the tip of the iceberg. But it was the biggest archive to have ever surfaced. Something I want to make clear is that the records did not show that most soldiers committed war crimes. What they did show was that there was a much bigger problem than the government had owned up to. Hundreds of soldiers had come forward to report atrocities. But what had the government done with all that information? The records didn't say. They didn't have the answer to that question. That would require tracking down the people who were named in the files. From the soldiers on the ground to their commanders, all the way up the chain of command to the Pentagon and the White House. Now, one of the most difficult jobs of being a reporter, is getting people who don't want to talk to talk. And this would be the biggest challenge of my career, this particular story, because we're talking about calling people out of the blue and asking them to talk about a deep, dark secret that they had been carrying around with them and keeping secret for decades. So I stopped and thought, what am I going to say? When they pick up the phone, what is my first line going to be? Because I'm only going to have, I think I'll have 10 seconds before they slam it down on me. They're not going to want to talk. What can I say? What would you say? What would be your opening line? Well, I'll tell you what I thought. I thought that, sweet talking is not going to work. I might win their trust, they might stay on the line for a little bit, but as soon as they knew what I was up to, I'd lose them forever. I thought I've got to be upfront from the very moment I open my mouth. I'm Deb Nelson, I'm from the LA Times. I found your name in a declassified file. And you know what? That worked. People stayed on the line. I worried that I'd be opening up old wounds, but do you know what I found? Those wounds hadn't closed. Men told me that they had been waiting for my call since the end of the war, wondering when it would come. Wives encouraged their husbands to answer my messages because they had lived with all that anguish that their husbands had kept inside all those years. They wanted them to talk about it. Now, I got to be honest with you. The people who talked immediately, the people who poured out their hearts, they were the ones that were the silent witnesses. The actual suspects and some of the higher-ups, they slammed doors or hung up on me, mostly. Most of them did. The first time I tried. The key difference between reporters who get the story and those who don't, not brilliance, good luck, it's persistence. Try again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Let me show you what I mean. Tracked down the platoon lieutenant in Florida who reportedly opened fire on 19 civilians, including babies and children, in a remote area of South Vietnam, according to sworn statements from members of his company. I had barely gotten my name out and just started to ask my question when he hung up. He said, "I'm not interested." Bang. But one thing I've learned over the years is that when you surprise people with a question, their first instinct is to hang up. And they do often. But then they think about it. They stew about it for a while. And sometimes they change their minds. They wish they'd talked. And if you don't call back, you never know. So I waited. I waited a couple months. Wanted to give him time to be emotionally ready for my next call. And I called back. I said, "I know you didn't want to talk. I'm just asking that you listen. I want you to know what the men said you did and what's going to be in my story before it's published." And then I told him. And he listened. He stayed on the line, and then he talked. I said, "Why? Why did it happen?" He said, "Sometimes people snap." I said, "Well, were you prosecuted for this?" And he said, No, I wasn't. I don't think anybody was. The Army captain who issued the order, according to the men in his company, to kill anything that moves, that led to the lieutenant opening fire, was harder. It took 3 years to get through to him. Knocked on his door, called him on the phone, sent email messages, sent a FedEx. He never talked to me before the LA Times stories, but when I was writing the book, I sent him a note saying, "I'm writing, I know you didn't want to talk, I'm writing a story. I'm writing a book now. if you change your mind, contact me. And he did. And he owned up to the massacre happening for the first time. I asked him, were you prosecuted? He said, no, I don't think anybody was. So, through efforts like that, managed to reach a lot of suspects, a lot of witnesses, a lot of people at a lot of Pentagon officials who had collected the records, some White House officials who were still alive. And we had pretty strong evidence that the military had not collected these records to hold anybody accountable, or to even hold themselves accountable, because the records showed there were a lot of policies and practices in the war that were leading to the killing of civilians. But there was one person that I thought might know, if anybody did, if the military did anything good with these records. He was a retired Pentagon official, and he was responsible for sending up monthly reports to the White House on how many war crimes had been reported, what the investigation had found, what the Army knew about them, what their status was. So I called him. I tracked him down in Tacoma, Washington, and I called him. He had one of those old-fashioned answering machines where, you can listen in while you decide if you want to pick up the phone or not. He didn't pick up the phone. So I called again. He didn't pick up the phone. I called again and again and again and again and again, and he didn't pick up the phone. I felt bad. I felt like I'm harassing this poor man. So finally I left a message that said, look, I'm sorry to keep bothering you, but I have to keep bothering you until you either talk to me or you tell me you don't want to talk. Just tell me you don't want to talk and I'll go away. He didn't answer. So what would your hunch be? What would you think? What would your conclusion be? Right? He wants to talk. He's got something on his chest, and he's afraid he's going to spill if he picks up that phone. It is just ready to come out. I thought, he's going to talk if I can just find a way to get through to him. All right, easy. I'll fly across the country and knock on his door, because I am sure that if I am face-to-face with him, he will talk to me. It's worth the airfare that I have to pull out of my own pocket. So I flew across the country. I only had a few hours, because I was teaching here. I had to be back to teach. So I only had a few hours on the ground to accomplish my mission. But I figured this is going to be a piece of cake. A friend picked me up at the airport, and we followed the GPS to where it said his house was. Well, we followed the GPS to 2 blocks from his house when I encountered this. A locked gate. He lived in a gated community with a fence that went around the entire neighborhood. Not only a gate, but a thorny hedgerow in front of the gate and a moat behind it. What the heck? All right, so I've still got 2 hours. I figure I'm just going to stand outside here and wait for somebody to come in or out, right? Then as the gate starts to close, I'll just kind of sneak in there real quickly. Well, I waited an hour, and nobody came in, and nobody came out. Now I've just got an hour left. The clock is ticking. And there is a hedgerow and a gate and a moat between me and my man. Could I add any more obstacles to this? Oh yeah, it's raining, and I have a broken arm from a ski accident. What would you do? What would you do? What would you do? What would you do? What do you think I did? Now he's already not answered the phone. He'll just listen to me again and not answer, right? I can't just call him. What would you do? How many of you would climb the fence? Raise your hand high. Yeah, really? Do you think I climbed the fence? Come on, what do you take me for? I'm an old lady with a broken arm. But I did notice a little depression under the fence where I think a dog had tried to, dug through. I crawled under the fence. I slithered under the fence. I scaled the side of the moat, climbed up on the bridge, brushed off my butt, and marched to the door. Thank you. I rang the bell. The door swung open, and there stood a huge woman on an oxygen tank. Really scary looking. "Go away," she said. "He doesn't want to talk to you." I kind of put my arm out so she'd feel sorry for me. "Please, I've come a long way. Just tell him I'm here. If he doesn't want to talk, I will go away." "Wait there," she snarled. "He's in the shower." Slammed the door. I waited for 10 minutes. And then he came out, and he talked. He talked. He asked if we could go in the living room. His wife said no. So we stood out on the porch in the rain for 45 minutes and talked. And he said that the records weren't collected to hold anybody accountable. The records had not been collected to change policies that were causing civilian killings. They weren't collected for lessons learned to prevent this from happening in the future. He explained that, under international law, nations are required to investigate reports of war crimes. And the Nixon administration was particularly paranoid. And they worried that somebody might actually come after them. And if they did, they'd have records to show that they had done the investigations they were required to do. He said they were collected just to cover their butts. But the public needed to know. He and others had come to believe that the public needed to know what had really happened. Because unless we acknowledge the past, we're condemned to repeat it. So the moral of this story, try again, and again and again. Thank you.